And let's get started with part 1. Okay. In the United States, it's only required in 3 of our states, California, Connecticut, and Texas, to actually report the CT dose. Now, it's probably a good idea to do it everywhere, but by law, it's only at the moment 3 states that are required. That is Connecticut. It might be hard to see, so that's why I've circled it. So the CT dose report can be really intimidating, but if we break it down into individual pieces, it'll be a lot easier. We're going to start off with CT dose index volume. And then this is an idea of, I have 3 dots here, red, yellow, and green, representing different slices that are sort of at different degrees of radiation dose. And red is red hot, there's a lot of dose, and green is there's not so much dose. So they're kind of like, they're like slices of toast. And you've got really red hot burnt toast on the left, and then you've got green kind of regular low dose toast. This is reported in units of milligray, and that's exposure to radiation dose. We're not even talking about cancer risk yet. We're just talking about the units of exposure. So one thing to be aware of, this is not actually a measurement that's reported. It's an estimation. The computer says, well, I know how much energy I put into this, and based on a phantom, this is what it ought to be. But there's no actual meter in there detecting what that patient is getting. Okay, next thing to know about dose length product. What is that? So that is basically taking into account, A, how hot is that slice, and how many slices did you do? Did you do it? Did you scan the whole body? Or did you just scan a little piece here or there? The dose length product is reported in milligrays centimeter, and it's also known by its acronym as DLP. This will be the most useful piece of information, but before we talk about that, there's a few other things we need to talk about. There's this thing out there in the literature called size-specific dose estimate. What that is, it's kind of like CT dose index volume, and it's about how hot is your individual slice on average. But it takes into account how big the patient is. So if you have a really big patient, the same amount of dose going into it, if you will. This is also in units of milligray, and it's kind of useful to compare different studies, you know, irrespective of how big and how long the scan was. Was it head to toe or was it just head? But you can't use this to calculate the DLP. So it's a bit of a dead-end calculation, but I just want to discuss it so that you're aware of what it represents. Okay. Now let's talk about cancer risk. Cancer risk, also known as effective dose, takes your DLP, so that stack of red hot slices, you multiply it by a conversion factor, and now you get a new unit. It's called millisievert. Now, millisievert is actually cancer risk. It's based on Hiroshima data. More on that later. It is something that you use to compare, let's say, a CT scan to an X-ray study so that you can have a sense of, well, how much dose is this really effective to the patient? So what is that conversion factor? It's all data based on Hiroshima, and it takes into account the age of the patient and the body part. And you notice that all of these numbers are less than 1, meaning that your DLP multiplied by the conversion factor will give you a number that is numerically less than the DLP. So here we have different body parts. Here we have different ages and some notable areas. You can see that the highest risk of cancer is in the youngest patient, an infant or 0 years old, and going to the abdomen and pelvis due to all the radiosensitive organs in there, including gonads, intestines, bones, are all radiosensitive. So that is 1/20th of your DLP. That's going to be the highest conversion factor. Now compare that to the lowest conversion factor, which is an adult head. So, you know, the adult head doesn't really have that much radiosensitive stuff. It's unlikely that that's going to lead to cancer. So that number is going to be the smallest, 1/500th of your DLP. So the takeaway from this really is, between those two extremes, kids are up to 25-fold higher cancer risk. So again, that's why we're having this lecture and talking about, well, what do we need to do to mitigate that risk? So one thing to be aware of, there's only 2 phantoms out there that estimate patient size. 2 phantoms for every patient in the world, big or small, young or old, 2 different phantoms. Now the kids are all assumed to be the size of a head 16 phantom. Basically, to make it simple, everyone says, well, every pediatric patient is like the size of an adult head, which is kind of silly when you think about it, but to keep things simple, that is what the assumption is. And then the body 32 phantom, it's a bigger phantom. You can see it's that bigger cylindrical disc. That's going to be for adult chest, abdomen, and pelvis, so-called body 32 phantom. Okay, now all of that stuff aside, I recommend on that report just looking at the DLP. And here are some numbers, and you might disagree with me, and that's fine. You've thought about it, and then I feel like I've been successful if you've thought about it. But for kids, abdomen and pelvis, I would say you could get away with having a DLP less than 200 and still have a high-quality study. For adults, they're bigger, so you're going to need a little bit more dose. You can get away with a scan under 500 milligray centimeter and still have a great study. Okay, getting back to the CT dose report, let's look at a sample and break it down line by line, number by number, and kind of discuss what all these things mean. This is a multi-phase abdomen and pelvis. This is a total DLP of about 1,000, which is way more than what I just told you is your target. So let's see how we achieved that high number and we'll start to think about how we could have lowered it. Okay, so in the first line, we see that the scout is not recorded with any numbers. Now there is radiation imparted with the scout. It's very small, but it's not included. So it's like a little asterisk. It's part of the dose that's not really acknowledged. The scan range tells you how long of a scan did you do. Did you do head to toe, just head to shoulders? How much of a length did you actually scan? There's our CT-DI vol. That's going to be the toast hotness, if you will, like what color is it, red, green, or blue? And then if you multiply the scan range times the CT-DI vol, that gives you your DLP, your dose length product. And then here, the tech has to say what phantom should be the best measurement for this patient. And so the technologist chooses which phantom. And there's only 2 options, the body 32 and the head 16. And those numbers reference the diameter in centimeters. Okay, so we've done a slice. And what have we done here? It says helical. And we see, okay, now we're generating some dose. So what happened here? Well, this was probably our non-contrast sequence. Okay, fine. We see we got a DLP of about 200. Now, what if, the technologist put in body 32, but what if the smaller head 16 phantom had been selected? What if the technologist incorrectly put in head 16? How would that affect the dose? Because again, the CT doesn't measure the dose. It just calculates it based on the assumptions of the energy put in and the phantom that the technologist picked. So if you were to do a head 16 selection, but you actually did a body, the DLP would be higher because the computer would say, whoa, you did the same amount of energy, but into a smaller object, the head 16 phantom. So the DLP is kind of like the concentration of dose, so it's going to be higher. Now, what if the patient was bigger than the phantom? So the technologist picked a phantom that was correct, the body 32, but the patient has a bigger diameter of their waistline than 32 centimeters. In that case, the computer doesn't realize that the patient is bigger and the amount of dose imparted. So the actual dose, the real dose that the patient experiences would be lower than what the computer is estimating. Okay, so that's not so bad, Okay, maybe that's a good thing. But now here's kind of for this lecture, what if the patient's waist was actually less than 32 centimeters, like a baby? The actual dose would be higher. So you would look at the number and think, oh, this isn't so bad. Andrew said be less than 200, but the patient is actually much less than that size. And they're actually getting a higher dose and you just don't realize it. So let's move on in the CT dose report. We've done another thing and we see scan range 100 to 100. That's kind of weird. So what is that? That's probably your smart prep or your timing bolus. It's looking at one slice and just scanning and doing it over time while it's collecting information about the contrast bolus. And you notice the dose is not that high. So if you're looking to cut corners on your CT dose, don't do it with your smart prep or timing bolus. That's a pretty small dose, and getting your timing right is really good because you certainly don't want to have to repeat your scan. Okay, now This is going to be our arterial phase. So it looks like we have the same scan range as we did for the non-contrast above, 35 to 310. And looks like we're going to do it again. Okay, so it looks like we're doing abdomen, pelvis. Now we have 35 to 538, so we've done a longer range. Now notice, why is the average dose a little bit different between the two? Well, for the second one, where we went into the pelvis, you have to punch through those bones in the pelvis, so your dose is going to be a little bit higher having done that. Now, 6.86 versus 7.17, not that different. So then DLP, why is that so different? It's almost 200 versus 400. It's almost twofold difference. Well, that's because the first scan was just through the abdomen. The second was abdomen and pelvis. So you did twice as much length of scanning. So that's why you have almost twice as much dose. So not so much because the CTDI vol changed, but because you're scanning more, you're giving more dose. Okay, what do we do now? Looks like we did another abdomen, probably doing some delayed, maybe a urographic phase, who knows? And we can see that the dose is pretty similar to the abdomen arterial, again, because it's the same distribution. So we did a non-con, a smart prep, an abdomen arterial, an abdomen venous, and an abdomen and delayed. And when you add all those up together, that's how you got such a high number. Individually, those sequences, those series were actually less than 500, that target that I suggested for adults. But it's because you did so many different scans that you exceeded that recommended threshold. And again, that's not a hard, fast rule, but just to keep in mind, when you scan more, you get more dose. That's pretty obvious. Okay, now, when reporting the dose, there's some free software options out there to get it into your report. And there's also some options that you can purchase to get it into your report. You can also just do it manually. The advantage of doing it manually is you actually see what it is. It forces you to write that number down and think to yourself, oh man, that number is bigger or lower, and what was different in this case? When it's automatic, it's kind of like your speed dial on your phone. You never kind of remember any of your friends' phone numbers because it's all done automated for you. So automated is easier, but it's also then easier to forget what doses you're actually giving to your patients. So we need to talk about, where does the dose play in terms of cancer risk? Does it play a risk at all? Like, is there even a point to this lecture? Well, I'll let you decide. So here we have a graph of cancer risk versus dose. We have to acknowledge that just being alive and living a life has its own cancer risk, which is pretty decent. A lot of people will die of cancer. It's not the most common cause of death. Usually it's heart disease, but still a lot of people get cancer. So we have to acknowledge that that's going to be confounding when we think about dose effects. High dose, high cancer risk, all from Hiroshima data. So it's this orange line way out up high on the graph. But the thing is, CT doses are down here. They're really low. Compared to Hiroshima, they're really low. So what does that mean? Does that have an effect on us when it's so low? So we don't really know for sure, is the bottom line. Now, the most conservative would be to assume what's called the linear no threshold. Basically, you draw a straight line from the Hiroshima data right to the 0, axis on the graph. In which case, that implies any dose, no matter how small, could be a risk, which we would care about because CT has a dose that's non-zero. But we don't know. There might be a situation like this where low doses don't even matter. It's like a little bit of a sunburn. It's not going to give you a high cancer risk just getting one sunburn. You get over it, you repair your DNA, and it's not until you get to a certain threshold that you start to see a cancer risk. There's also some in vitro data and non-human data to suggest that a little bit of radiation is actually good for you. Like maybe a CT dose is good for you, like a glass of wine every night. We don't know. The safest and most conservative and the basis of all the discussion in this lecture are the linear no threshold. And there are people that disagree with that, but the consensus is let's be on the safe side. So here are our CT doses. Way down here, we're going to zoom that up because now we're going to talk about CT doses, which compared to Hiroshima are low. So we're now in the CT dose land. We're assuming linear no threshold and talking about cancer risk. So let's put some numbers on it. Now instead of dose, I've got on the x-axis your DLP, the thing that I said you want to care about. And I've got effective dose, millisieverts, on the y-axis, your cancer risk. And now I've made that orange line the benchmark for a 1-year-old. I've put in a few numbers here to get perspective of our CT doses. For pediatrics, I said try and stay below 200, and millisieverts in the single digits is where CTs usually end up being. The older you are, the curve becomes less steep, meaning that any given dose has a lower cancer risk the older that you are. To put some things into context, just flying across the Atlantic gives you a 0.05 millisieverts dose. That's pretty low. Just living your life every year with natural causes to radiation is about 3 millisieverts. Now, if you were to target arbitrarily, let's say, I just don't want my CT scan to have a dose that exceeds 3 millisieverts because it's yearly exposure. Fine. Well, what does that mean? If you were to try and achieve that, you can see that for a 1-year-old, that orange line intersects the blue line at about 100 DLP, whereas an adult is about 200. So you have much less dose to play with if you're trying to achieve the same cancer risk. So 100 for a 1-year-old versus 200 for an adult. Now, I've changed the scale a little bit. The millisieverts here has jumped with 100 up. And I said, whoa, millisieverts should be in the single digits. Well, in the region around where I work, and you just look at all CT scans at all hospitals in the area where I work, academic and private, again, here's earth exposure, pretty low down there. You will see there's very high variability just depending on where you get your CT scan done. Now, fortunately, these graphs are a little bit disingenuous. They're not actually representing the midline. Most of these doses are low, but this is the range of dose. And I've kind of, like emotional scare tactic, made it all red for the abdomen pelvis, because when you start hitting millisieverts of the double and triple digits, you're talking about probably a real cancer risk, meaning that if you had a CT scan of 100 millisieverts, that's really high. That's probably getting at, of 100 people, if they were to get that high dose, probably one of those people is going to get a cancer that they should not have. Again, that's all based on Hiroshima data, not perfect numbers, but you really don't want to be that high. And you don't need to be. The point of this lecture is you don't need to be that high to get a good quality study. That is the end of the first part of this lecture. So I'm going to pause for a bit, and in a moment, we're going to restart in part 2.